The prison guard invited the ex-con to humiliate him, but she came with a lawyer and 5 legal claims that would destroy everything he thought he knew about power. Well, 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 if it isn't prisoner 47291, Officer Marcus Webb sneered as he opened the door to his lakeside cabin. The autumn evening was crisp, but the malice in his voice could have frozen summer itself. I wasn't sure you'd actually show up, Rodriguez. Thought maybe you'd learn to stay in your place by now. Sarah Rodriguez stood on his doorstep, her 34-year-old frame steady despite the 8 years of hell this man had put her through behind bars. The invitation had arrived 3 weeks after her release, a wedding invitation with a handwritten note that made her stomach turn. Come see what a real woman looks like when she marries a real man. Front row seat reserved just for you. Hello, Officer Webb, she replied calmly, her voice carrying none of the broken desperation he remembered from their last encounter in solitary confinement. Something in her tone made him pause. This wasn't the same woman who had begged him to stop during those dark nights when the cameras mysteriously malfunctioned. The years had changed her in ways Marcus couldn't immediately recognize. Where he expected to see the hollow-eyed desperation of a broken ex-convict, he found clear, intelligent eyes that studied him with unsettling intensity. Her posture was different too, no longer the hunched, defensive stance of someone trying to make herself invisible, but the confident bearing of someone who had nothing left to fear. Behind her, a man in an expensive navy suit stepped forward. Good evening, Mr. Webb. I'm attorney James Morrison from Morrison & Associates. My client has some matters she'd like to discuss with you before tomorrow's ceremony. Marcus's confident smirk faltered. What the hell is this? Sarah, what kind of game are you playing? The lawyer opened a leather briefcase and pulled out a thick manila folder. No games, Mr. Webb. Just justice. My client has spent the last 6 months documenting some very interesting information about your conduct during your tenure at Riverside Correctional. Sarah's eyes never left Marcus's face as she watched the color drain from his cheeks. For 8 years, she had endured his abuse, his threats, his systematic destruction of her complaints through official channels. She had been a first-time offender embezzlement to pay for her daughter's medical bills when insurance denied coverage for experimental leukemia treatment. The irony wasn't lost on her that trying to save her child's life had led to losing 8 years of it. Marcus had spotted her vulnerability from day one. A middle-class accountant with no street knowledge, no connections, no understanding of prison politics. He'd isolated her from other inmates, convinced her that cooperation was her only path to survival, then systematically exploited the desperation for his own twisted purposes. You can't prove anything, Marcus stammered, his hand gripping the doorframe. It's your word against mine. No one's going to believe an ex-con over a decorated officer. Sarah smiled for the first time in years, not the broken, desperate smile she'd worn in prison, but something Marcus had never seen before. The smile of someone who held all the cards. Actually, Mr. Webb, Attorney Morrison interjected, we have quite substantial evidence. Security footage from your personal devices, financial records showing payments made to silence other victims, and sworn statements from 6 former inmates. Oh, and these. He held up a small recording device that made Marcus's blood run cold. It was the same model he'd seen in electronics stores, the kind that could run for hours undetected. You see, Sarah continued, her voice maintaining that same unsettling calm, I spent 8 years learning your patterns, Marcus. Every corrupt guard you worked with, every inmate you targeted, every time you thought you were untouchable. I memorized shift changes, documented your financial transactions, and built relationships with women whose lives you destroyed. Marcus's world began to crumble as he realized that the woman standing before him was no longer the terrified prisoner he remembered. This was someone who had used every moment of her freedom to methodically build a case that would end his career, his marriage, and his freedom. Tomorrow's wedding should be very interesting, Sarah said quietly. Especially when your bride and all your colleagues learn exactly what kind of man you really are. The autumn wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of coming storms and the promise of long-overdue reckonings. As Marcus stared at the evidence that could destroy his entire life, one question burned in his mind. How had the broken woman he'd tormented for 8 years managed to orchestrate something this devastating? What he didn't know was that Sarah's true plan was far more intricate than even she had revealed to her lawyer, and tomorrow's wedding would expose secrets that went far deeper than anyone imagined. If you're drawn to stories of justice and redemption, don't forget to subscribe to see how Sarah's carefully constructed plan unfolds in ways that will leave everyone speechless. You think you can walk into my life and threaten me? Marcus slammed the door behind him, stepping onto the porch where Sarah and her lawyer waited. His hands were shaking, but his voice carried the same venom that had terrorized inmates for over a decade. I've been protecting this community from scum like you for 15 years. My record is spotless. The irony wasn't lost on Sarah. Marcus Webb had built his entire identity on being untouchable. 15 years of promotions, commendations, and community awards, all built on a foundation of systematic abuse that no one had dared to challenge. Until now. Attorney Morrison pulled out a tablet, swiping to a video file. Mr. Webb, is this your voice? Nobody's going to believe a convict over me. Keep your mouth shut or your sentence gets extended. The recording was crystal clear, Marcus's voice threatening a young woman in what appeared to be a storage closet. Sarah watched as Marcus's face went from red to pale. She remembered that day perfectly. It was Jessica Martinez, barely 21, serving 6 months for shoplifting baby formula for her newborn. Marcus had cornered her after she tried to report his inappropriate behavior to the warden. Jessica had lasted 2 more months before attempting suicide in her cell. That's taken out of context, Marcus stammered, but his confidence was cracking like ice under pressure. You can't just record people without consent. This is harassment, intimidation of a law enforcement officer. Actually, the lawyer smiled coldly, this was recorded by the security system you personally installed in your office. The same system that somehow kept malfunctioning whenever you took certain inmates to disciplinary meetings. Interesting how the technical problems were so selective, don't you think? Marcus had always been careful about his image. He coached Little League Baseball, volunteered at church fundraisers, donated to police benevolent funds. The perfect public servant with a dark private life that he'd convinced himself was justified. After all, these women were criminals. They deserved whatever happened to them. Sarah's mind drifted to her wedding dress hanging in her apartment, not for her own wedding, but the bridesmaid dress she'd bought for tomorrow's ceremony. Marcus's bride-to-be, Detective Lisa Chun, had been Sarah's pen pal during her final year in prison. Lisa had no idea that the woman she'd been writing to, offering encouragement and friendship, was the same ex-convict her fiancé had brutalized. You want to know what's really interesting? Sarah continued, her voice maintaining that unsettling calm. Your fiancée Lisa thinks she's been mentoring a reformed criminal named Sofia Rodriguez. That's me, Marcus. For 8 months, she's been telling me everything about your relationship, your habits, your schedule. Marcus pulled out his phone with trembling fingers. Lisa needs to know about this harassment. She'll have you both arrested for extortion, stalking, conspiracy. Please call her, Sarah said softly, a hint of satisfaction creeping into her voice. Ask her about the letters she's been writing to inmate support groups. Ask her about the woman named Sofia she's been mentoring. Ask her what she thinks about prison guards who abuse their power. The phone slipped from Marcus's fingers, clattering on the wooden porch floor. The sound seemed to echo through his mind as the full scope of Sarah's preparation became clear. For months, Sarah had been corresponding with Lisa under an assumed name, carefully learning about Marcus's home life, his habits, his schedule. Lisa had unknowingly provided details about Marcus's nightmares, his drinking problem, his paranoia about ungrateful convicts coming after him. She'd even mentioned how Marcus insisted on having cameras throughout their house because he was terrified of retaliation. Your nightmares, Sarah continued, studying his face. Lisa told me about them. How you wake up screaming about prisoners coming for revenge. How you check the locks 3 times every night. How you keep a loaded gun in every room because you're terrified of payback. Marcus's bravado was completely gone now, replaced by the raw fear of a man who'd finally met his match. What do you want from me? Money? I can pay you to keep quiet about this. You see, Mr. Webb, Attorney Morrison continued, pulling out more documents, my client didn't just document your crimes. She studied you. She learned your patterns, your weaknesses, your fears. Tomorrow's wedding isn't just about exposing you, it's about showing the world who you really are when you think no one is watching. Sarah stood up slowly, her calm demeanor more terrifying than any threat. I don't want your money, Marcus. I want justice for Jessica Martinez, who never recovered from what you did to her. She's still in therapy, still afraid to be alone with men in authority. I want justice for Carmen Rodriguez, no relation despite the name, who served an extra year because she tried to report your abuse and you had her written up for making false accusations against staff. The autumn evening grew darker as Sarah continued, her voice gaining strength with each name. I want justice for Maria Santos, who you assaulted in the laundry room and then had transferred to maximum security when she complained. For Angela Williams, who you threatened with solitary confinement unless she cooperated with your demands. For 17 other women whose lives you destroyed because you believed your badge made you untouchable. Marcus sank into a porch chair, finally understanding that the broken woman he'd tormented had spent 8 years planning this moment. But what he still didn't realize was that Sarah's plan extended far beyond just destroying him. The beautiful thing about patience, Marcus, is that it allows you to build something perfect, Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. While you thought you'd broken me, I was documenting every corrupt guard you worked with, every warden who covered for you, every system that allowed your abuse to continue unchecked. Tomorrow's wedding would reveal connections that reached into the highest levels of the prison system, and Marcus was just the first domino in a line that stretched further than anyone imagined. The real question wasn't whether Sarah would get her revenge, but whether Marcus would survive learning the true scope of what he'd unleashed by underestimating a woman who had nothing left to lose and everything to gain. 17 victims, Sarah repeated, watching Marcus's face contort with each name. But you still don't understand the scope of what you've unleashed, do you? Attorney Morrison stepped closer, his tablet displaying a web of connections that made Marcus's blood run cold. Mr. Webb, meet Detective Sarah Rodriguez. Yes, your fiancée's pen pal Sophia has been using her real name all along. She's been corresponding with Lisa for 8 months, learning everything about your routine, your fears, your secrets. Marcus stumbled backward, his mind racing to process this revelation. That's illegal surveillance. Entrapment. You can't use information obtained under false pretenses. Actually, a new voice interrupted from the driveway. It's called building a federal case. A woman in a crisp FBI jacket emerged from a black SUV, her badge gleaming under the porch lights. Agent Patricia Valdez, Public Corruption Unit. Mr. Webb, we've been investigating Riverside Correctional for 2 years. Ms. Rodriguez became our most valuable asset the day she walked out of your prison. The pieces of Sarah's 8-year puzzle began falling into place with terrifying precision. While Marcus believed he'd broken her spirit during those endless nights of abuse, she'd been documenting every corrupt guard, memorizing shift patterns, and building relationships with other victims. The storage room where he'd assaulted Jessica Martinez? Sarah had been assigned to clean it the next morning, finding evidence he'd carelessly left behind. The storage closet recordings weren't accidents, Sarah explained, her voice steady despite the rage burning in her chest. I installed those cameras myself during work detail. The financial records showing payments to silence victims? I helped trace those accounts through the prison's computer system when I worked in administration. Every piece of evidence you're seeing tonight took months to gather, and you handed us most of it yourself. Sarah's transformation hadn't begun with her release. It had started 3 years into her sentence when she'd met Dr. Rebecca Torres, a civil rights lawyer doing pro bono work for inmates. Dr. Torres had seen something in Sarah's meticulous documentation of abuse, her careful notes hidden in her personal Bible, her ability to remember dates, times, and witnesses with photographic precision. Marcus's phone buzzed with a text message. His hands shook as he read, "Wedding cancelled. FBI agents at my house searching everything. Don't contact me. We're done. Lisa." She found the letters, Sarah said quietly, pulling out a manila envelope. The real ones. The ones you wrote to your friend Officer Bradley bragging about breaking in the new fish. The ones where you described exactly what you did to Jessica Martinez and the others. Here's my personal favorite. Rodriguez cried so hard I thought she might hyperventilate, but that's what makes it fun. Agent Valdez moved closer as Sarah continued reading. Or this gem. These bitches think they can file complaints? I'll show them what happens to snitches. By the time I'm done with Rodriguez, she'll be begging me to stop just so she can finish her sentence quietly. The autumn air grew thick with Marcus's desperation as the full scope of his exposure became clear. Lisa had been wearing a wire for 3 weeks, recording every conversation where Marcus had bragged about his conquests, every moment he'd let his guard down and revealed the monster beneath his public persona. You see, Marcus, Sarah continued, Lisa isn't just a detective, she's internal affairs. Has been for 2 years. When Agent Valdez approached her about investigating corruption at Riverside, Lisa volunteered immediately. She'd been receiving reports about guard misconduct, but could never get inmates to testify. Until she started corresponding with me. Marcus pulled out his service weapon with trembling hands, his 15 years of authority crumbling around him. You can't destroy my life like this. I have a career, a reputation, a community that respects me. Lower the weapon, Webb, Agent Valdez commanded, her own gun drawn with practiced efficiency. You're already facing federal charges for civil rights violations, sexual assault, conspiracy, and racketeering. Don't add threatening federal agents to the list. But Sarah stepped forward, unafraid, her eyes locked on Marcus's terrified face. He won't shoot. Marcus Webb is many things: a predator, an abuser, a coward who only feels powerful when his victims are helpless, but he's not suicidal. He knows exactly what happens to corrupt cops in federal prison. Don't you, Marcus? The gun trembled in his hands as memories of his own threats came back to haunt him. How many times had he told inmates that snitches didn't survive long behind bars? How many times had he described the fate waiting for anyone who crossed him? Now those same words felt like prophecies of his own doom. The 17 women you victimized aren't just my fellow survivors, Sarah continued, her voice gaining power with each word. They're mothers, daughters, sisters who've been waiting years for someone to believe them. Jessica Martinez attempted suicide because of what you did, but she survived. She's testifying tomorrow, Marcus. Carmen Rodriguez served extra time because you retaliated against her complaint, but she documented everything. Maria Santos, Angela Williams, they're all coming forward. Marcus's weapon clattered to the porch floor as he realized that tomorrow wasn't just about exposing his crimes. It was about revealing a corruption network that reached far deeper than anyone suspected. Warden Thompson, who'd transferred compliant victims to Marcus's block. Officer Bradley, who'd helped cover up incidents. Dr. Harrison, the prison psychiatrist who diagnosed resistant inmates with mental illnesses to justify solitary confinement. Every person who enabled your abuse, every official who ignored complaints, every system that protected you while silencing your victims, Sarah said, watching understanding dawn in Marcus's eyes. Tomorrow's wedding was supposed to be your moment of triumph. Instead, it'll be the day an entire corrupt network falls. The question that would haunt Marcus through his sleepless night wasn't whether Sarah would destroy him, but whether he would survive learning just how many powerful people were about to fall alongside him when the dominoes finally stopped falling, and whether the prison system he'd relied on to protect him would show him the same mercy he'd shown 17 helpless women. The St. Mary's Cathedral was packed with 300 guests when the first FBI agents walked through the ornate doors. Marcus sat in the front pew, his hands cuffed behind his back, watching his carefully constructed life disintegrate in real time. Ladies and gentlemen, Agent Valdez announced to the stunned crowd, this ceremony is now a federal crime scene. Please remain seated while we execute our warrants. The wedding guests, police officers, prison officials, city council members, sat frozen as agents moved through the rows, serving subpoenas and making arrests. Marcus watched in horror as his best man, Warden Thompson, was handcuffed for accepting bribes to transfer compliant female inmates to Marcus's block. His groomsmen, fellow guards who had participated in the abuse network, were led away one by one. Sarah stood at the altar where Marcus was supposed to be married, now wearing her real clothes, a simple black suit that commanded more respect than any wedding dress ever could. In her hands was a thick folder containing 8 years of meticulous documentation. Marcus Webb, she began, her voice carrying clearly through the cathedral sound system. For 8 years, you told me I was nothing. That I was worthless. That no one would ever believe a convict over a decorated officer. She opened the folder. You were wrong on all counts. The congregation gasped as Agent Morrison projected images onto the cathedral screens, security footage of Marcus assaulting inmates, financial records showing his payments to silence victims, text messages bragging about his private disciplinary sessions. Each piece of evidence had been collected during Sarah's systematic investigation, with help from 17 other survivors who had finally found the courage to speak. Lisa Chun, still in her wedding dress, stood at the back of the cathedral with tears streaming down her face. I recorded everything, she announced to the crowd. Every conversation where he bragged about what he did. Every time he laughed about breaking women who couldn't fight back. I've been working with the FBI for 3 weeks. Marcus finally found his voice, desperate and broken. Sarah, please. I was different then. I can change. I have money, I can make this right. Make it right. Sarah's voice rose with 8 years of suppressed rage. Can you bring back Jessica Martinez, who killed herself 6 months after her release because of what you did to her? Can you undo the trauma you inflicted on Carmen Rodriguez, who still can't sleep without nightmares? Can you restore the dignity you stole from 17 women who trusted the system to protect them? The cathedral fell silent except for the sound of handcuffs clicking shut as more conspirators were arrested. Marcus's mother, who had flown in from Ohio for the wedding, sobbed openly as she realized what her son had become. Your badge, your authority, your reputation, Sarah continued, all of it was built on the broken spirits of women you thought would never fight back. But we didn't just fight back, Marcus. We organized. We documented. We waited for the perfect moment to show the world who you really are. Agent Valdez stepped forward with a final arrest warrant. Marcus Webb, you're under federal indictment for civil rights violations, sexual assault, conspiracy, and racketeering. The evidence collected by Ms. Rodriguez and our task force has led to charges against 43 individuals in what we're calling the largest prison corruption case in state history. As Marcus was led away in shackles, passing the same pews where his colleagues and friends sat in stunned silence, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in 8 years: peace. Not the hollow satisfaction of revenge, but the profound relief of justice finally served. The cathedral emptied slowly, guests whispering in shock and shame. Many of them had known about the rumors, the whispered stories, the female inmates who seemed to disappear into the system's shadows. Their silence had been complicity, and today they had watched that complicity exposed in the most public way possible. But as Sarah gathered her evidence files, she knew this moment was just the beginning of something much larger, a reckoning that would reach into every corner of a system that had protected predators while silencing their victims, and the question that would define the trials to come was whether justice delayed could still become justice delivered when the full scope of the conspiracy finally came to light. 18 months later, Sarah Rodriguez walked through the halls of the Department of Justice in Washington, D.C., her heels clicking confidently on the marble floors. The woman who once scrubbed prison floors now carried a briefcase containing policy recommendations that would reshape correctional institutions nationwide. Ms. Rodriguez, Attorney General Patricia Williams, smiled as Sarah entered the conference room. Your testimony before Congress last week was extraordinary. The Prison Reform Act of 2026 wouldn't exist without your courage. Sarah had become more than a survivor. She had become the architect of systemic change. Her foundation, Voices Behind Bars, had helped over 200 former inmates reintegrate into society, while her consulting work with the FBI had led to corruption investigations in 12 states. The 8 years she'd spent documenting abuse had transformed into a career fighting for those who couldn't fight for themselves. Meanwhile, Marcus Webb sat in his federal prison cell, staring at a newspaper article about Sarah's latest achievement. The irony wasn't lost on him. He was now experiencing the same powerlessness he'd once inflicted on others. His marriage had dissolved, his pension revoked, his reputation destroyed. Former colleagues crossed the street to avoid being seen near him. The 17 women he'd victimized had each received substantial settlements from the class action lawsuit Sarah had helped organize. Jessica Martinez's family used their settlement to establish a scholarship fund for children of incarcerated parents. Carmen Rodriguez had returned to school and become a social worker specializing in trauma recovery. Lisa Chun, the detective who'd been Marcus's unwitting accomplice before becoming his greatest betrayer, now headed the state's new Prison Oversight Commission. She testified that Sarah's methodical approach to justice had taught her what real police work looked like: patient, thorough, and focused on protecting the vulnerable rather than exploiting them. The hardest part, Sarah told a packed auditorium at Harvard Law School during her keynote speech, wasn't surviving 8 years of abuse. It was choosing to transform that pain into purpose rather than letting it consume me with hatred. The audience of future lawyers hung on every word as she continued. Marcus Webb thought he'd broken me, but he actually forged me. Every night he made me feel powerless became fuel for the day I'd reclaim not just my own power, but help others find theirs. Agent Valdez, who'd worked the case, later told reporters that Sarah's investigation was the most methodical and comprehensive she'd seen in 20 years of federal law enforcement. Most victims want immediate revenge, she explained. Sarah wanted permanent change. The corruption network that had protected Marcus and his co-conspirators was dismantled piece by piece. 43 officials received federal sentences, the prison system underwent complete restructuring, and new oversight mechanisms were established to prevent future abuse. But perhaps the most powerful moment came when Sarah visited Riverside Correctional, not as a prisoner, but as a federal inspector. She walked through the same corridors where she'd once been victimized, now carrying the authority to ensure no other woman would suffer as she had. The current inmates watched in awe as this composed, dignified woman reviewed their files and listened to their complaints with genuine concern. They didn't know her history, but they sensed something important was happening. Someone who understood their world was finally in a position to change it. As Sarah's car pulled away from the prison that final time, she reflected on the truth she'd learned through her journey. The best revenge isn't destroying your enemies, but building something so powerful and positive that their hatred becomes irrelevant. Marcus Webb had tried to break her spirit, but instead he'd awakened a force for justice that would outlast them both. The woman who'd once begged a corrupt guard for mercy had become someone who could grant justice to thousands. Sometimes the most devastating defeat you can inflict on those who wrong you is simply refusing to let their cruelty define your destiny. If this story of turning pain into purpose resonated with you, subscribe to our channel for more inspiring tales of how ordinary people overcome extraordinary challenges and transform their struggles into strength that changes the world.